Refined in the Lake of Fire 2, The Evidence, Part 1. Most popular Bible translations in English read, "The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever." Revelation 20:10. This translation is so bad, it has completely twisted the meaning of this passage, and it originated in English in the 16th century, more than 1,000 years after St. Jerome gave us the Latin Vulgate. Since my original presentation, Refined in the Lake of Fire, I have gathered more evidence that the Apostle John is in fact using the Old Testament crucible metaphor in the book of Revelation, as found in the following passages: Proverbs 17:3, Proverbs 25:4, Malachi 3 verses 2-4, Ezekiel 22:18, Isaiah 1:25, and Psalm 12:6. Now, I can't find any reference to a lake of fire in all Christian history before William Tyndale mistranslated these passages. Now, if this is not the Old Testament crucible metaphor here in the book of Revelation, we would have to assume that the Apostle John was inventing an entirely new concept in the Bible out of nowhere without any scriptural authority or explanation. Now, as I have pointed out in the past, sulfur has been used in gold and silver refining processes since antiquity. Knowing that silver is quite reactive with sulfur, I was skeptical it would be used in silver refining. But Pliny the Elder, a contemporary of John the Apostle, describes both gold and silver refining processes using sulfur. Interestingly, Pliny provides a silver refining process for Egyptian silver, a formula that requires sulfur. Interestingly, this formula Pliny describes is an alloy of silver and copper, which is exactly what sterling silver is today. Per Encyclopedia Britannica, alloys of silver with copper are harder, tougher, and more fusible than pure silver and are used for jewelry and coinage. It's interesting that this is ancient knowledge that Pliny attributes to the ancient Egyptians. We read, "With the silver are mixed 2/3 of the finest Cyprian copper, that known as coronarium, and a proportion of live sulfur equal to that of the silver. The whole of these are then melted in an earthen vessel well luted with potter's clay, the operation being completed when the cover becomes detached from the vessel." Hence we read in Proverbs 17:3, "The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart." Interestingly, Cyprian copper came from the Greek island of Cyprus in the ancient world, known for its pure copper. In Greek, the word Cyprus is pronounced Kypros. It's where we get our word copper. Now, I'm not a chemist, but as far as I know, both copper and silver are highly reactive with sulfur, so please don't try this ancient formula at home. Otherwise, you might find out what John meant by the smoke of their torment the hard way. Perhaps a chemist out there can explain how this ancient process of purifying silver alloys with sulfur might work. From what I can gather, at high enough temperatures, sulfur will combine with the oxygen that is tarnishing the silver to form sulfur dioxide gas, freeing the silver from the oxygen, making it shiny and new. It sounds like a highly toxic combination to me. Again, please don't try this at home. My only point is that sulfur was used in various gold and silver refining processes in the ancient world, known in John's day and apparently known by John the Apostle himself. In this series, I am going to defend the following translation as the correct translation of Revelation 20:10 in English. "The devil who deceived them was thrown into the crucible, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be interrogated day and night into the ages, the great age." Revelation 20:10, translation and emphasis mine. The other translation I considered, which maybe some translators would prefer, "The devil who deceived them was thrown into the blazing sulfurized crucible, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be examined day and night into the ages of that world." Now, that translation is somewhat inspired by Wycliffe's translation coming out of the Vulgate, and examined is the Latin euphemism for interrogation. And if you were to translate from the Vulgate, you could arrive at something like that, although Jerome is the one who injected the word tormented into this passage. And I suspect that was because the Latin euphemism examined would over-soften this passage. And in the ancient world, the word tormented would have brought to mind the idea of interrogation, but that completely goes over our heads today, so it's a bad translation. But I'm going to defend this first translation. It's coming right out of the Greek text. It's not a Latin derivation. So let's begin with this last phrase of this verse, "into the ages, the great age." eis tous iones ton ionen. Now, this traditional translation, forever and ever, comes from outer space somewhere. That's not what the Apostle John said at all. That is putting words into his mouth. Even William Tyndale didn't insert the conjunction and into this passage. And that's not what's in the text. I've traced this translation to the Douay-Rheims Bible in 1582 and later copied by the King James in 1611. But at least there is no lake of fire in the Rheims New Testament. It's still the pool of fire at that point in time. To get an idea how bad this translation is, consider this clip from a presentation I did some years back. This is a genitive case structure with the second noun modifying the first. If you understand that, then you would understand why the translation forever and ever is undiluted nonsense. Ever does not modify forever in that structure. The translation forever and ever also drops the definite article, adds a conjunction, and introduces a false preposition. They're not just fudging the translation a little, they're flat out lying, and that should give you some clue as to the validity of the false doctrine of eternal punishment. They completely destroyed the entire construct of the sentence and injected into the passage what they wanted it to say. This is called translating with doctrine in mind. In this case, they are translating with Augustine's false doctrine of eternal punishment in mind and pushing it into the translation. So even in English originally, there was no lake of fire, it was the pool of fire, and there was no forever and ever in these passages. Those ideas are merely translational accretions, pushing a doctrine, not what's in the Greek text. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this last phrase, beginning with the first word of the phrase, the Greek preposition eis. It is almost always translated as into in the Bible, sometimes in, and every Greek lexicon agrees with my translation. This is not controversial at all. So let's move on. So next we find the Greek definite article tous, which appears 740 times in the New Testament. It is almost always translated as the in English. So my translation is not controversial at all. It's actually the majority opinion of translators. Next, we also have the spelling ton, which is also the definite article the. It is commonly translated simply as the or of the in English. My translation is simply the, although of the would work also. And although of the wouldn't change the meaning of this passage, I see no good reason to inject a preposition into the text that isn't there. Now we have the two plural nouns, ionis and ionen. Every Greek lexicon agrees these nouns mean an age. For example, our first plural noun is ionis. In 2 Chronicles 6:2 in the Septuagint, Solomon's temple is ionis, which is the same noun used in Revelation 20:10. And Solomon's temple was long gone before Christ even arrived on earth. The translators of the Septuagint clearly understood this to be a long but limited time frame, ages. My translation is therefore ages, in keeping with the actual definition of the word and its usage in the Greek Septuagint. Solomon's temple stood for 400 years. It was ionis. Now our second plural noun, ionen, which is the same noun in declension, is used past tense in the New Testament 4 times. And here are the passages. I will allow you to pause the video and read them. Ionen patently does not mean forever. Now granted, this plural noun does refer to a very long time frame, but it does not mean forever or infinity. St. Jerome did not believe this meant infinity either. That idea originated in English, and it wasn't even in early English translations. So if the Apostle John wanted us to believe that God punishes people forever in the book of Revelation, he sure doesn't know how to tell us with any kind of clarity. He is in fact saying exactly the opposite. This is ionen. It is a long time frame, not infinity. And as I've pointed out at this channel before, Christ does not reign forever and ever. He only reigns until the last knee has bowed, and the reign of the kingdom is then handed back to the Father, that God may be all in all. That was always what the apostles understood and taught. Then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet, not forever and ever. But you might be asking, why did I translate this plural noun ionen as great age and not simply ages? The reason I chose this hyphenated word, great age, is because John is using declension in this phrase to add specificity. He's not trying to multiply the ages as many assume. Unfortunately, the English language is almost completely devoid of declension. One rare example of declension in English is our plural noun, women. We don't add an S at the end of woman and say womans. We use declension and say women. And this is what John is doing in this passage. So consider the following sentence. In my town, there is a gym that is only for the ladies, the women. Now, this is very similar to the construct John is using in this phrase, eis tuos ionis ton ionen, which is why it's very difficult to translate in English without creating a hyphenated word like I did. But notice from this example, I'm not trying to say there's an infinite number of women in my town, and I'm not trying to multiply anything. I'm merely adding specificity. And that's exactly what John is doing here. In short, my translation using this hyphenated word, great age, is simulating declension in English. And I do believe that comes very close to what the original readers would have seen, but every translation is a bit of a compromise. In part 2, I will be briefly covering the translation interrogated in this passage. If you want a sneak preview of that presentation, see the video Bible Torment Explained, linked in the description. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the crucible, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be interrogated day and night into the ages, the great age, where we are right now. God bless you, and thank you for listening.